In January 1933, the great industrialists of Germany, men with names that still crown street signs and football stadiums, sat down with the leader of a movement they had spent years trying to control. They had been funding him. Their money had already made him plausible. Their factories would soon make him powerful. And the bankers, especially the bankers, were about to extend him credit on a scale that turned a struggling fringe party into the most heavily armed state in continental Europe. Within 6 years, this consortium of steel, coal and rifle steel money would be generating the foreign exchange, the hidden budgets, and the illusion of legitimacy that the Third Reich needed to abolish democracy, occupy the Rhineland, swallow Austria, and dismember Czechoslovakia. Within 12, those same balance sheets, bank statements, share ledgers, board minutes, would be stapled into evidence at Nuremberg. Yet almost no one who signed them would go to prison. The worst of them would walk and then return to their villas. That outcome did not happen by accident. It happened because the institutions that decide who pays had decided in advance that some forms of power were too expensive to punish. Tonight, we are going to trace that decision, line by line, and let the documents do the talking. Keep one date in mind. October the 20th, 1942. In Washington, the United States Alien Property Custodian, Leo T. Crowley, signed a vesting order that seized the assets of a small Manhattan bank, the Union Banking Corporation. The order ran to 4 typed pages. It listed 3 men, a New York senator's father-in-law, an elderly Wall Street private banker, and a younger Republican from Connecticut, whose grandson would, one day, sit in the Oval Office. The order alleged that this little bank had, between 1924 and 1942, acted as the American banking arm of the German industrialist Fritz Thyssen, routing funds, gold and steel contracts to companies whose output went, in the end, into the smokestacks of Auschwitz. The senator's name was Prescott Bush. He had been a director for 9 years. He had signed the minutes. So who, exactly, was on the other side of that paper trail? And why did so many of them survive the war richer than when it began? By the time Hitler invited the captains of German industry into the Reich Chancellery on the 20th of January 1933, the country was already a pyramid of debt. The Depression had wiped roughly a quarter off German national income. By 1932, unemployment, on the official count, had breached 6 million, and the real figure was higher. 6 big banks, Deutsche Bank, Dresdner, Commerzbank, Danat, the Darmstädter and Berliner Handelsgesellschaft, were technically insolvent. Industrial output was running at barely half of 1928 levels. The state itself, in Adam Tooze's phrase, from the wages of destruction, was already insolvent. The only question was who would extend the next credit line, and on what terms. Hitler's answer was money. Specifically, the newly appointed president of the Reichsbank, Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht, a reappointment engineered in March 1933 by a coalition of the very bankers who had just sat across the table from him. Schacht was by then an international celebrity. He had stabilized the Weimar hypermarket in 1923. He had resigned in 1930 over the Young Plan. He was, the financial historian Albert Henrichs has written, the only German banker Wall Street still trusted by name. And what Wall Street trusted, Wall Street lent to. Behind Schacht's bow tie, the regime quickly built a financial machine that historians now call, with restrained horror, the MEFO trick. MEFO stood for Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft and a paper company, founded in 1934 and registered to 4 of the regime's biggest steel and arms firms, including Krupp and Rheinmetall. MEFO issued bills of exchange, essentially promises to pay, guaranteed by the state. The Reichsbank, with Schacht at the helm, accepted those bills and rediscounted them, in effect printing new Reichsmarks to back them. The bills did not show up in the budget. They did not pass through Parliament. They did not appear on the official public debt. By 1938, the cumulative stock of hidden MEFO bills stood, as Tooze has carefully reconstructed, at roughly 12 billion Reichsmarks. That is, close to half of 1 year's total German national income, diverted to tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. None of the 4 MEFO guarantor firms paid a pfennig until well after the war began. Their gift to the regime was, in fact, a loan to themselves, signed under the imprimatur of a printed central bank seal. Where did the foreign exchange come from? Mostly from the front companies. Between 1924 and 1931, an obscure Holland-based entity called the International Telephone and Telegraph Corporation, by 1933 the 3rd largest American company abroad, run by Sosthenes Bain, quietly issued bonds denominated in dollars to refinance the German telephone network. By the time ITT's German subsidiary became an instrument of the Wehrmacht, Bain had arranged more than $100 million of credit lines for the Reich. Then there were the Americans themselves. Standard Oil of New Jersey continued to ship tetraethyl lead and crude to IG Farben refineries through 1939. Ford Werke, the German subsidiary, accepted a Reich defense contract worth the modern equivalent of $300 million for truck production in 1941 alone. Henry Ashby Turner, the Yale historian General Motors commissioned to investigate itself, later concluded in General Motors and the Nazis that the Detroit parent company knew by 1934 that its Opel subsidiary was supplying trucks to Nazi paramilitaries and chose, on balance, not to object. None of this moves the needle of what historians call conspiracy, but it is what Adam Tooze calls a willing pool of capital on both sides of the Atlantic, and it is what made MIFO's hidden $12 billion convertible into actual guns. Understand the men who made those decisions? Walk with me back to Dusseldorf in the autumn of 1923. A 46-year-old steel heir named Fritz Thyssen stood in a cloth cap outside the gate of his family-owned United Steelworks, watching workers march to a Krupp meeting. The mark was crashing. A dollar bought 4 billion of them by November. Thyssen had been radicalized by the French occupation of the Ruhr, and like most of his colleagues, he had arrived by 1919 or 1920 at a quiet bargain with a corporal from Braunau who was then running a Munich party of fewer than 2,000 members. Thyssen detailed the bargain in 1941 in a memoir written while he was a political prisoner in a sanatorium. The book was called I Paid Hitler. The first payment, the one he kept, remember, was a contribution of 100,000 Reichsmarks in 1930. Delivered personally to an NSDAP treasurer, Thyssen declined to name. Over the next 3 years, Thyssen, his brother Heinrich, their Vereinigte Stahlwerke Consortium, and a small cluster of heavy industrial Ruhr families would, by Henrik Eberle's accounting in Ludwig Klinkhammer und das Dritte Reich, funnel more than 4 million marks to the Nazi Party. Thyssen also introduced Hitler at rallies arranged for industrial audiences at Dusseldorf and Essen. He sat in the front row. He smiled for the cameras. When, in 1934, Thyssen wrote a private letter to Hitler warning him off genuinely socialist economic policy, the letter went unanswered. Thyssen took the silence for friendship. It was a category error he would not entirely escape. Not when the regime began stripping Jewish ownership from his own assets, not even on Kristallnacht, when he resigned from the party. He was arrested in 1940, persuaded to write I Paid Hitler as a kind of confession, and served what remained of the war in Dachau and then Buchenwald. He emerged in 1948 a broken man. Heinrich, his brother, committed suicide in 1943, but the room that mattered most was the one on the 20th of January 1933. Schacht, recently reappointed, still untested, was not there, but he was the financial scaffolding of what came out. The chamber was Hitler's private office at the Reich Chancellery. Thyssen had engineered the guest list. Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, head of the Krupp Empire, sat the next chair over from Wolf Dietrich von Witzleben, head of the salt works at Heilbronn. Beside them were representatives of the steel and chemical industries. IG Farben, Siemens, Allianz. 12 men in total. Hitler spoke for over an hour. The transcripts and several eyewitness accounts place him promising, in categorical terms, that a Nazi government would repudiate the Versailles Treaty, restore conscription, abolish parliamentary government, and rearm. Would the assembled industrialists back him? The reply, by tradition, was that of Gustav Krupp. We will support you financially. The published minutes, where they exist, are thin. The meeting was not meant to be documented, yet the outcome is unambiguous. Within weeks of the 30th of January appointment, Thyssen had arranged the deposit of 3 million Reichsmarks, supplied by Krupp, by Thyssen himself, and by Cornissen, to fund the party's immediate expenses, including the flood of propaganda posters for the March 1933 election. Within months, the Nazi vote had doubled, then tripled, then demolished the field. Now turn the camera. By 1938, a parallel storyline is unfolding 500 miles west, in a small square building on the Kentrelbahnplatz in Basel, Switzerland. It is the Bank for International Settlements, the world's first attempt at an international central bank. Founded in 1930 to handle German reparations, hijacked into a clearinghouse for European hot money. On Saturday mornings, the Director General, a former Bank of England executive called Pierre Quenet, working under the BIS president, Montague Norman of the Bank of England, would routinely process telegrams marked urgent and signed by executives of the Reichsbank. By 1938, the Reichsbank was using BIS accounts to launder the gold reserves the Wehrmacht was stripping from the national banks of every country it entered. On the 14th of March 1939, 2 months after the German seizure of Prague, the Bank of England transferred £5.6 million of Czechoslovak gold from the BIS account of the National Bank of Czechoslovakia into a labeled Reichsbank account. As Martin Franklin and Stephen Gibbs first documented in The Guardian in 2013, citing BIS records newly released by the Bank of England under Freedom of Information, the acting governor at the time of the transfer's clearance was not Norman himself, but his deputy, Sir Ernest Harvey. The point of that caveat is not to exculpate Norman. It is to make clear the regime was procedural, a transfer authorized under the BIS bylaws, signed by officials whose letters were kept on file for 30 more years at a Swiss bank that the United Nations survived as the central bank of central banks in the post-war world. In New York, The parallel is smaller and quieter. Union Banking Corporation was incorporated in 1924 by Prescott Bush, his father-in-law George Herbert Walker, and a former Hamburg banker called Johann Groninger, the man who would chair the board. Walker and Bush were senior partners at W.A. Harriman & Co., the Wall Street merchant bank that handled the Harriman Railroads. Their firm's vice president was Averell Harriman, soon to be FDR's Lend-Lease czar in London. UBC's ostensible job was to hold the German bonds that Harriman partners had underwritten through the 1920s. Its actual job, after 1936-ish, was to hold the personal funds of the Thyssen family interests in the Vereinigte Stahlwerke. The same Fritz Thyssen who, by then, was deep into Mefo-guarantor territory. In October 1942, Treasury agents arrived at UBC's office at 39 Broadway. The vesting order they carried would, in plain language, freeze every cent the bank held, on the grounds that these were enemy assets within the meaning of the Trading with the Enemy Act. By 1952, UBC had been wound up and its remaining assets dispersed. No one was indicted. Here's the contradiction that has eaten at honest historians for 80 years. On the morning of May the 1st, 1946, the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, the same court that would, 2 months later, hang Goering for crimes against peace, opened the indictment against the grandees of German finance. The dock contained not only Schacht, but also 17 other named industrialists and financiers, including Krupp, the Flick representative, and the chairman of the economic group of the Reichstag. Of those 18, 14 were acquitted. 4 were found guilty on narrower counts. Schacht himself walked. The Soviet judges on the bench filed a written dissent, stating that Schacht had been chief financier of the Nazi Party and the Hitler State from the moment of its seizure of power. Robert H. Jackson, the chief American prosecutor, did not oppose the dissent. He simply did not appeal. Jackson later told his staff that the best case he could have made was circumstantial, and the Soviets' verbal enthusiasm had not earned the prosecution any new witnesses. Schacht would, in 1947, be sentenced by a Bavarian denazification tribunal to 8 years of hard labor, but that sentence was overturned on appeal in 1948. He returned to private life. He consulted for Egyptian and Indonesian governments. He died, aged 90 in 1970. Krupp, whose great-grandfather had armed the first Bismarck, was convicted in a separate Nuremberg industrialists' trial, Case 11, for plunder of French industry and the use of slave labor. His sentence was 12 years. He served 3. After his release in 1951, he was not disincorporated. The Krupp Empire was reconstituted as a family foundation, the Alfred Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach Foundation, which today owns a 60% stake in the still publicly listed company. Alfred von Bohlen und Halbach, his son, was convicted in 1948 of having personally approved the use of Soviet prisoners of war as slave labor. He too served 3 years. The foundation today disperses roughly 10 million euros a year in German cultural philanthropy. The subsequent Nuremberg trials, 12 of them covering doctors, judges, generals, and the IG Farben board, produced 24 convictions. The longest sentence was 12 years. No one hanged a private sector German executive at Nuremberg. And then there is IG Farben. In its heyday before the war, IG Farben had been the largest industrial corporation in Europe, the parent of BASF, Bayer, Hoechst, and Agfa. It owned a 30% stake in the chemical company that licensed, developed, and sold Zyklon B, the cyanide-based pesticide that the SS, with IG Farben's explicit engineering recommendation, deployed in the gas chambers of Auschwitz from September 1941 onward. IG Farben's internal documents, captured by Allied investigators, contained a memo to the Auschwitz plant director suggesting that Jewish women be brought over to dig foundations for a new factory and, in this way, dispose of the soil of what is now no longer useful. After the IG Farben trial, Case 6 of the subsequent tribunals, concluded in 1948, 11 of the 24 directors were convicted. 3 received a sentence of 8 years. Their case was, in the brilliant phrase of historian Peter Hayes, a conviction that leaves the corporation standing. Within 6 months, IG Farben had divided itself back into its 3 legacy chemical companies. By 1957, they had merged into a new shell company under their old combined name. None were required to indemnify survivors, so now we tally what it cost. 6 million Jews and roughly the same number of so-called subhumans murdered by the Nazi state and its collaborators. 27 million Soviet citizens dead. 45 million Europeans below the wartime line of 1938, civilian and military. The New York Federal Reserve's wartime index of industrial output in the United States ran hotter than at any point since. General Patton's friend Albert Vogler, chairman of United Steelworks and a rising industrialist in the very Vereinigte Stahlwerke Thyssen had helped control, committed suicide in April 1945 as the American tanks were entering Thuringia. Vogler, like his associate Friedrich Flick, had been on the Allies' post-war target list, but he had already taken the verdict into his own hands. Flick survived the war and received a 7-year sentence at Nuremberg. He served 4, He returned to the office of Friedrich Flick Industrieverwaltung, which today maintains a Krupp-like web of interests in BMW, energy infrastructure, and the chemical sector. The Vereinigte Stahlwerke, the Thyssen-built industrial empire that had once underwritten MEFO, was broken up under Allied decree in 1953 into its component steel, mining, and chemical firms. By the 1990s, the federal government of Germany had quietly absorbed most of those firms back into a state-owned, then partially privatized, industrial cult still known in DAX trading circles by the abbreviation ThyssenKrupp. The families rebuilt, the legal persons returned, the capital, in the deepest sense of the word, survived. Now, and I want to be very careful here, because the temptation to flatten this into a 30-second moral clip is strong, the picture is genuinely more complicated than any single documentary will tell you. Schacht did fall out of favor with Hitler. He was removed from the Reichsbank in January 1939, after years of escalating private objections to deficit spending. He was later interned at Flossenburg and then Dachau himself, and at Nuremberg he argued, with no small evidentiary support, that he had been marginalized by the regime well before the war. Fritz Thyssen is a more ambiguous figure still. He sided with the regime's policies and earned both its favors and its punishments, and his own 1941 confession, far from exonerating him, names men and dollar figures. Henry Ashby Turner, the GM historian, has spent 30 years arguing that General Motors was a victim of opportunity, not a fellow traveler. He is probably right on the narrow company history. The UBC story, in particular, has been, pardon the expression, monetized in American politics. Jane Mayer's dark money lineage traces it through Mitt Romney and beyond, and every election cycle adds another infrared video of a senator relating the UBC seizure. The actual bank transferred funds. It did not, on the evidence now in the public record, design the extermination. And yet, something steady remains when you pull back from the legal trivia. The flow of capital from the German industrialists to a violent political movement is documented. The flow of central bank credit from the Reichsbank to that movement is documented. The flow of foreign exchange through Swiss, Dutch, and one Manhattan bank to the regime's war machine is documented. The under-prosecution of all of this at Nuremberg is documented. The relative lack of corporate mortality compared to the mortality of millions is documented. None of these facts requires conspiracy. What they require is the quieter word complicity, which the Oxford English Dictionary defines as an act of taking part in wrongdoing alongside someone else, and the recognition that, when companies do not die with their decisions tend not to. So what is the lesson here? It is not that bankers are uniquely evil. Some were good. One distinguished himself by refusing. Another tried to warn Hitler and was simply ignored. It is not the older lesson that capitalism loves fascism. There were capitalists who paid for both, and capitalists who paid for the war that ended fascism. The more durable lesson is procedural. When the men who issue the bills of exchange and underwrite the loans and sell the bonds can be sure that the worst that will happen is that their corporate persons will get a name change, that the assets, the offices, the foundations, and the offices will persist, then they have an inbuilt incentive to finance risk that no human being should bear. Adam Tooze's book is not a conspiracy book. It is an economics book. And his conclusion, repeated by Libor in The Euro, and echoed by Robert Skidelsky's biographies of Keynes, is that the cost of capital is too low when the bearer of that cost can be a corporate person that cannot die and cannot be hanged. The names change. The flourishes continue. The bankers got their grandchildren. If you made it this far, drop a comment with the word debt and tell me whether you think the bankers of 1933 could have seen what they were underwriting, or whether you think, in the words of the great John Kenneth Galbraith, they simply could not imagine what the institutions they were financing would become. 3 minutes of your time, one ranked comment, and a real question that we'll answer in the next video. Subscribe if you want more history like this, the slow paper trail kind, the kind only footnotes can hold.